The Bart mania craze of the early 90s brought us a slew of mostly 8-bit Bart-centric adventures, most of which being of questionable quality, but also often undeniably imaginative. His evolution into 16-bit form on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis brought us 2 more surreal and rambunctious experiences, or perhaps more like 11 of them, depending on how you count up the variety of gameplay concepts thrown into the mix. Often remembered with disdain for being overly confusing and challenging weekend rentals, as usual I like to delve a little bit deeper into these supposed disasters to see for myself. So let's check out Bart's Nightmare and Virtual Bart. First up, we'll look at Bart's Nightmare. With a North American release on the Super Nintendo in October of 1992, European and Japanese releases 3 months later, and eventually a Genesis port for North America and Europe in August of 1993. All of these were published by Acclaim, or their Sega-focused division, Flying Edge. As you might have noticed, Acclaim handling the vast majority of Simpsons games being pumped out at the time. Development was handled by Sculptured Software, who also worked on other large franchises like the Super Star Wars series and the Super Nintendo versions of the first 3 Mortal Kombat games. More notable here, though, is the involvement of designer Bill Williams, who developed some obscure but unique and forward-thinking computer titles in the 80s. He would eventually call his experience working on Bart's Nightmare to become Bill's Nightmare, thanks to frustrations with game design in a corporate environment. And it actually led him to quit the game industry entirely after handing off a nearly complete version of the game to another programmer. Bill's wildly creative energy really shines through in the gameplay concepts presented in Bart's Nightmare. I'm gonna try my best to explain how things work here, and will likely sound like a complete lunatic in the process, so buckle in. The basic setup is that Bart has fallen asleep while doing his schoolwork, and must navigate the surreal dream world of his subconscious to track down several pages of his homework that have been scattered about. The primary hub, Windy World, has you walking and jumping around on a side-scrolling pseudo-3D plane, and avoiding a wide variety of enemies as you search for a homework page blowing along in the wind. Everything from Jebediah Springfield heads, packs of schoolyard bullies, auto-driving his school bus, flying saxophones whose music notes reverse your controls, a Lisa Simpson fairy that turns you into a frog, or Principal Skinner who forces you to change into your Sunday school attire. Interestingly, a lot of these status ailments, or enemies for lack of a better word, interact with each other in interesting ways, like how Lisa is actually needed to help you escape from Jimbo and his gang by turning them into rats, or the old lady blowing kisses will undo your frog transformation. And Skinner's wardrobe adjustment makes you invincible, but you walk much slower and are unable to use items, at least until you jump into a mud puddle. Speaking of items, you'll need to jump over these killer mailboxes to hopefully spawn pickups like bubblegum, watermelons, and cola, which aren't exactly weapons, but do provide new ways to interact with Springfield's residents in various ways or protect yourself. One of the more unusual core concepts of the gameplay in Windy World is how Bart's health is handled, with a sleep meter full of Z's at the top of the screen, and making contact with certain enemies will take one away. To get more back, you'll need to use that limited supply of bubblegum to blow bubbles at any blue Z's that are flying around the screen. But you'll also need pretty good timing and screen placement here, as once the bubble hits the Z, it flies upwards and must be caught within the position of the sleep meter on the screen, as anything to the left or right will just fly away. Not to mention the Z's will move left and right at different speeds relative to your movement, so you can't always simply chase them down whenever you see one. Oh, and there are red Z's too, which naturally subtract from your supply. Oh, and if you're down to only one remaining Z, your sleep meter has no boundaries at all, so the next Z you get will create a different size sleep meter depending on your positioning, which could be massively larger or painfully tiny. Other health-related items include pillows, typically obtained by jumping over mutated radioactive fish, which after getting 3 of them will basically act as an extra life and create a fresh new sleep meter for you if you run out of Z's. And you can also hop onto skateboards, which gradually restore Z's the longer you can stay on. When things finally get dire and you have no Z's remaining, the screen starts to fade to white and the music becomes more sparse and atmospheric, and one more hit will wake up Bart and end the game. All in all, it's a pretty unhinged and creative system here, and man, we haven't even gotten out of the level hub yet. So all of this walking around has the ultimate goal of finding a homework page and jumping on it, which is generally a random occurrence, but there are ways to make them appear instantly by interacting with the world in various ways. Once you do finally land on a page, Bart shrinks down to size, and you must quickly choose one of two different colored doors, which transport you into a corresponding minigame, which will grant you a page of your lost homework if you can manage to complete it. The pages can be collected in any order at least, with 8 of them total across 5 different games. The blue door will transform you into Bartman, flying through the clouds over Springfield with your trusty slingshot, avoiding various hazards like lightning bolts, rockets, hang gliding Nelsons, and several mini-bosses, my personal favorite here being a burping Barney on a pink elephant. Finally, you'll face off with Mr. Burns in a biplane, and if you can beat him without running out of lives, a homework page is yours. This is probably one of the least difficult minigames of the bunch, but still very fun with some shmup-like combat going on, requiring shooting smartly to accommodate the arcing path and physics of your slingshot rocks. Another fairly easy but immensely satisfying minigame to me lies behind the purple door, pumping a microscopic Bart into his own bloodstream, where he must inflate roving hostile germs until they explode, kind of like a weird underwater Dig Dug situation. Gradually you'll notice Smilin' Joe Fission's pickups to appear, with 5 of them needing to be picked up to complete the stage. Again, this minigame is not overly difficult and rather short, but I really dig the single screen arcade approach here, along with the trippy visuals and sound design. The green door will see you take form as Bartzilla, starting off with you wreaking havoc on Springfield, stomping on buildings, and blasting away incoming tanks, trains, helicopters, and planes, with either your fireball breath or laser beam eyes, which notably must be fired in the correct direction, along with choosing the correct attack type for the situation. So it may take a few tries on this one to get the hang of the controls. You don't have a visible health meter here, but taking too much damage will fail you out of the game. If you can survive long enough to get hit by a shrink ray, the second half of the minigame will have you climbing a skyscraper reminiscent of the arcade oddity Crazy Climber, albeit the control scheme isn't as intricate. As you climb higher, avoiding random junk being dropped out of windows, you'll also need to avoid the legendary Mothra, and finally make direct contact with Homer Kong at the very top. The yellow door will drop you right into your own house, seemingly turned into an Itchy and Scratchy cartoon, right in the middle of their typical hyper-violent conflicts, along with various household objects like lamps, vacuums, and furnaces being hazardous as well. You'll need to pick up weapons like the hammer, fire extinguisher, and plunger gun to defend yourself in the various rooms, with this minigame also being split up into 2 parts, which must be completed separately. This one can get pretty nasty, with very fast-moving enemies, and some certain attacks quickly reducing you to a pile of ashes in one hit. And finally, what I found to be the most challenging of the 5, the orange door, the Temple of Maggie. As Idaho Simpson, you have to navigate a grid of precarious columns while avoiding hopping devils and occasional pacifier cannon fire in the background. The tricky part here is that jumping on a column will push it down slightly, and usually push another column up at the same time. Columns that are already too low cannot be safely jumped on, and doing so will fail the minigame, unless you happen to grab one of the extra life egg pickups before the pterodactyl does. Overall, it's a fairly frantic puzzle experience, as you must use quite a bit of trial and error to find a safe path forward while avoiding being poked to your doom. Luckily, a correct route can be memorized once you figure it out, but unless you're extremely lucky or some kind of god gamer genius, you'll need to experiment on this level a lot to succeed through both parts and get both pages here. And I won't spoil something major, but I'll at least say it's really worth your while to read the manual about this minigame for knowledge of something that is not very intuitive, but rather crucial to your success. So once the game ends, either from running out of Z's, or if you successfully acquired all 8 pages of homework, Bart wakes up and you'll receive a letter grade based on your score and see slightly different ending screens with different reactions from your family depending on how high of a grade you end up with. Beating the game doesn't necessarily just give you an A either, so if you get really deep into this, you might figure out ways to grind out your score a bit more to get true approval from your family. And with that, Bart's nightmare is over, and I gotta say, it gets a top grade from me after recently giving it a proper playthrough. The gameplay mechanics are undeniably strange and sometimes unintuitive, so reading the manual or a basic guide is really recommended to come to grips at first. But I really appreciated the creative approach here that melded really nicely with the surreal but lighthearted presentation of Bart's subconscious, which naturally gave way to a charming blend of references to the cartoon, joyfully thrown together in a haphazard manner that makes perfect sense for the concept. The music and graphics are really wonderful as well and do justice to the original art style, and I think the SNES version gets a slight edge here if we're comparing ports, with some extra visual effects and cleaner sounding music and audio. Not that there's anything wrong with the Genesis port, mind you, the gameplay translated over very faithfully, and all of the content is left intact, so probably only those very familiar with the game will notice slight differences in controls and the difficulty of some of the minigames. Regardless of which version, I hope more people revisit this game with an open mind, get over the bad experience you might likely have had as a confused child renting this one back when it came out, and let yourself drift off into this wildly imaginative universe rich with challenge and humor.
Virtual Bart!
1994 would bring us a sequel of sorts with Virtual Bart, again published by Acclaim and again developed by Sculptured Software, with releases on both the Super Nintendo and Genesis in North America, Europe, and Japan, although this time around there were a few noticeable differences in the ports which we'll get into later, as we explore further into yet another Bart venture loaded with variety and weirdness. The basic plot setup here surrounds a school science fair, where Martin's exhibit features a virtual reality machine with 6 different educational modules. Naturally, Bart decides to mess with it and gets trapped in the device and must finish all of the programs to escape. So again, it's another framework for a variety of minigames in ridiculous environments. But this time around, we have a much more simplified method of access as compared to the Windy World, with an anxious Bart here simply laid out on a spinning wheel that randomly launches you into one of the 6 games, and the game ends either when you finish the 6 games or lose all of your lives. No continues. Luckily, there's at least a practice mode that lets you pick whichever game you want to play, but there's no way to make any real game progress there. You'll need to piece together a successful run using the wheel of the main game mode. First, we'll get into the platformers, which comprise 3 of the 6 games here. Pig Bart has you controlling a pig version of Bart, trying to escape Krusty's pork processing factory, and freeing his fellow pigs as well in the process. The levels here are a bit maze-like, with levers you need to hit to open up cages, hidden keys needed to access new areas, along with tons of doors that warp you around the factory, which is also full of deadly clowns looking to recapture you. You can only run and jump, but you can do a butt bounce maneuver to damage enemies or bounce yourself up to higher areas. It's pretty easy to get lost in this one, and definitely has some difficult platforming at times, but there are some pretty hilarious visual gags strewn about here. Baby Bart has you controlling a baby version of Bart, who decides to chase after an ice cream truck, embarking on a brutally precarious journey of awkward platforming through his backyard, the streets of Springfield, and finally, a circus tent. You'll swing off of tree branches, ride a balloon, drive a baby cart, and even use your diaper as a parachute in what I found to be the most challenging platformer of the bunch. While it's mostly straightforward side-scrolling, you'll really need to get a handle on the janky controls and physics here, and some moments require some very tight timing or even blind leaps of faith. And you might be seeing a theme here, but Dino Bart has you controlling a dinosaur version of Bart. Imagine that. In this one, you'll be running and jumping around, not only dealing with environmental hazards and other dinosaurs, but also prehistoric versions of the other members of the Simpsons family and friends. You do have some means of attack here, with a tail whip and a limited use roar to clear the screen of enemies. This is the most fast-paced platformer of the three, with quick movement and reflexes needed to survive an onslaught of hazards and a couple of boss fights as well. This is probably my favorite game of the bunch, but you can chalk that up to me being obsessed with dinosaurs when I was a kid.
No.
The other half of the mini-games bring in a wider variety of gameplay beyond platforming. Mount Splashmore is a water slide ride with a view behind Bart careening down a labyrinthian nightmare, not only having to avoid other riders, but also choose the correct path down to the exit. Time is of the essence here, so you'll try to avoid going down a tunnel where Homer is stuck, or some choices even just eject you out of the slide entirely. There are at least clock pickups you can grab for more time, along with temporary invincibility surfboards. This one controls about as well as you expect it would. Given the water slide gimmick, it's slippery and generally chaotic. Doomsday Bart takes place in a post-apocalyptic Springfield, where a Mad Max-like Bart must ride his motorcycle back home before time runs out. You have to maintain enough speed while avoiding various rocks and hazards in the road, hitting checkpoints to earn more time on the clock, and of course deal with marauding bullies along the way. Luckily, you have a shotgun. Alright, it shoots water balloons, but still.
Oh, man. Oh, no.
Finally, one of the more memorable games of the group is Class Picture, where Bart decides to ruin the day's class photo by hitting his classmates with tomatoes and eggs. With carefully timed button presses, you can determine the distance of your throw, and pressing left or right can also alter your aim. You have a limited amount of ammo, with the main objective of hitting every single student wandering around the area, and hitting any adult character passing through will end the game immediately, so you have to be pretty precise on this one. This is one of the more memorable and interesting mini-games, but that doesn't make it any less challenging. So that covers all of the virtual modules here, and while overall they do provide longer gameplay experiences than the 5 games within Bart's Nightmare, they feel a bit less polished and thoughtful this time around. Each of the platformers have their own unique but janky control feel, which can easily lead to frustrations, especially considering how long some of the levels are. And the other 3 mini-games will also require quite a lot of experimentation to figure out their little quirks and how to clear them. In general, Virtual Bart provides much more of a sadistic feeling challenge, which might deter more casual players from trying to beat this one. But I will admit that putting in the hard work to do so does lead to a pretty satisfying victory once you can piece together a successful run. I just can't say it's really an undertaking I'd like to do multiple times. Something about it is lacking the creative drive and charm of Bart's Nightmare, and it just feels a bit more grueling. Now don't let me completely dissuade anyone here though. In the end, it still has plenty of fun references here and there, and practice mode is a really fun way to just pick it up and play your favorite minigame. And that brutal challenge of actually completing the game always lies in wait for those intrepid explorers of jank who dare to attempt it. And real quickly, I'll mention those noticeable differences between the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions, although I don't necessarily suggest one over the other. One obvious change is in Doomsday Bart, with the SNES flexing that Mode 7 for a more impressive 3D look. There are also some slight challenge tweaks here and there, such as the lack of crumbling platforms in the Genesis Dino Bart. And while I truly am a fan of the FM sound chip on the Sega, in this case, the music conversion sounds a bit undercooked. But overall, you can't go too wrong with either version here. The core of the content is still very much intact, and it probably just comes down to personal preference of platform in the end. And if you've made it this far, maybe you're thinking, oh, Bart totally forgot about the Sega Genesis version of Bart vs. the Space Mutants. No, I didn't just try to erase this one from my childhood memories, but for today's purposes, I really only wanted to cover the original 16-bit Bart games, as Space Mutants was released on a wide range of consoles and computer platforms before this eventual 16-bit Sega Genesis version seen here. It definitely has some noticeable changes compared to the most well-known NES version, but I won't get into that today, as I admittedly have never been able to beat this one, and I don't have a fully formed opinion on it yet. I'll also mention these weren't the only 16-bit Simpsons games either. We can't forget Itchy and Scratchy getting their own chaotic action game, along with the Lemmings-like puzzle platformer Krusty's Super Fun House. Now maybe someday we can just do a big old journey through all of the Simpsons games. Let me know in the comments if you're into that daunting idea. But with that, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much for watching, and if you're looking for another fever dream of a Bart game, have a look at my review of Bart's House of Weirdness, an obscure DOS title by Konami. And we'll catch you next time.